India's GDP growth for the quarter ended June 2025 came in significantly higher than estimates from various entities. What contributed to this positive surprise? Parts of our economy did well, but there was also something called the deflator that contributed. Let's dive deep. Hello and welcome back to Business Matters with the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. India's GDP growth surged to a 5-quarter high of 7.8% for the April-June period this year. This compares with the Reserve Bank's estimate of 6.5%. While real growth accelerated, nominal GDP growth slowed to 8.8% compared with 9.7% a year earlier. Growth in the gross value added or GVA has been broad-based. The services sector led the spurt, growing by an impressive 9.3%, significantly up from 6.8% a year earlier. Manufacturing also contributed, growing by 7.7%, a slight increase from the 7.6% in the prior year period. Agriculture too demonstrated good growth at 3.7% compared with just 1.5%. Private final consumption expenditure recorded 7% growth. Further, a Nielsen study that the Finance Ministry cited in its latest monthly economic review showed that FMCG volume sales in urban India were at a healthy 6%. Rural growth outdid urban volume sales, and rural growth remained buoyant at 8.4%. Investment also saw a good 7.8% growth. This was led by the central government front-loading its capital expenditure. However, the Reserve Bank of India's August bulletin showed a decline in sales growth for non-financial companies across sectors for all of the quarter. All of this data put together suggests an inconsistency in sales growth. Replying to our questions for this episode, Rajani Sinha, Chief Economist at CareEdge Ratings, explains that in India, real GDP growth is first calculated at the nominal level. So, nominal GDP is calculated first, then a deflator is applied to that number to account for inflation to arrive at real GDP growth rates. She elaborates that the GDP deflator is broadly estimated from a weighted mix of the consumer price index and the wholesale price index. She stresses its importance as a good estimate for price rise in the country as it captures price movement in the entire spectrum of economic activities as against WPI or CPI that measure price movement for a fixed basket. So what happened in Q1 of this financial year? Very low WPI inflation, which came in at about 0.3% average for the quarter, and a sharp moderation in retail inflation to 2.7% contributed to a very low deflator. The GDP deflator for the quarter ended June came in at close to about 1%. This compares with 3.1% for the immediately preceding quarter, which is March 2025. The quarter ended March 2025. This unusually low GDP deflator had a positive impact on real GDP growth. As Ms. Sinha points out, during periods of low inflation, this adjustment can make real GDP appear healthier than underlying economic momentum. This, she says, highlights the need to view real growth alongside nominal GDP growth for a balanced assessment. A Bloomberg article quotes Goldman Sachs economists as saying that actual underlying real growth could have been overstated by this unusually low GDP deflator. And they say this deflator is partly driven by highly volatile food items. They go on to say that if a more appropriate deflator had been applied, then actual real GDP growth could have clocked in at a growth that is 50 percentage points lower. That is, instead of 7.8%, it could have been 7.3%. HSBC goes further than that to say that the deflator could have actually contributed a full percentage point to real GDP growth. Nomura economists have said that the GDP data is not a signal of strong underlying demand, as it was boosted by low deflators and even early shipments of goods to the US before the tariffs kicked in. India, unlike developed economies, does not yet have a direct measure such as the PPI or the Producer Price Index, which encompasses both goods and services. The services deflator, for instance, moderated sharply in Q1. MK Research points out that real GDP growth is likely to be statistically boosted through the year because of a low deflator, especially for services, which is deflated using the WPI. And you may recall the WPI actually tracks goods and not services. The good news is, as Ms. Rajani Sinha of CareEdge points out, is that the government of India is working on bringing out the PPI, which would eventually, she says, replace the WPI and provide a more comprehensive reflection of price trends. CareEdge estimates that for the current financial year, which will end in March 2026, GDP growth rate would be at 6.5%, assuming that the 25% secondary tariffs that the US has imposed on India just because we are purchasing Russian oil, if that is removed, then the outlook is 6.5% growth. But if the current 50% tariffs imposed by the US continue, then growth could moderate to closer to 6%. That brings us to the Did You Know section that we have for you every episode. Here it goes. Did you know that the concept of GDP, gross domestic product, was first proposed in 1937 in a report to the US Congress in response to the Great Depression? This was conceived of and presented by an economist at the National Bureau of Economic Research, Simon Kuznets. And here's the quiz question for this week. When did GDP become widely adopted as a standard means for measuring national economies? The answer to last week's question, which was, what does the game Senet signify? It means passing, and it became associated with the journey to the afterlife. Some of the squares of the game corresponded to the hazards a person might meet on their journey to the afterlife, while other squares helped the players. Because of this connection, the Senet was not just a game, it was also a symbol for the struggle to obtain immortality. That brings us to the end of this episode, folks. If you enjoyed what you saw, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until we meet again next week, have a wonderful time ahead.